Have you ever noticed how the people who say "I don't care" the loudest are the ones whose hands shake when they say it? There's something strange about indifference when it's performed. Real indifference is quiet, forgettable. It doesn't announce itself, but pretended indifference. It demands an audience. It needs witnesses. It requires constant maintenance. You know this person. Maybe you are this person. They shrug when you share good news. They say whatever when plans collapse. They respond to vulnerability with "it's not that deep." They wear apathy like armor, like if they pretend hard enough, then not caring will become real. But here's what most people miss. The performance itself is the confession, because if you truly didn't care, you wouldn't need to prove it. So what's really happening beneath that carefully constructed facade? And more importantly, why do some people need the world to believe they're untouchable when they're actually breaking inside? Let me tell you something about emotional armor. It's heavy, and it doesn't just keep others out. It keeps you locked in. See, when someone insists they don't care, they're not revealing absence. They're revealing protection, because indifference doesn't need a costume. Real indifference is effortless, but performed indifference, that takes energy, constant vigilance, a never-ending internal script. Watch closely. Watch the micro-expressions that betray them, the split-second tightening around the eyes, the slight hesitation before the shrug, the way their jaw clenches when they say those three words, "I don't care." Psychologists call this emotional suppression, the deliberate attempt to inhibit or hide emotional responses. But it's more complex than that. When you pretend not to care, you're not just suppressing emotion. You're creating an entire persona, a character who exists to protect the real person underneath. And that takes extraordinary energy. Think about it. You have to monitor every facial expression, calibrate every response, ensure that nothing, absolutely nothing, reveals what you're actually feeling. You're an actor who never leaves the stage. And the exhausting part, you're both the performer and the audience. But here's what's fascinating. The harder someone works to appear indifferent, the more they're revealing how deeply they actually care. So where does this begin? The answer is almost always the same place. Childhood. Those formative years when you learned that caring was dangerous. Maybe you cared about something passionately, a friendship, a dream, a parent's approval, and that care was weaponized against you. Maybe you were mocked for being too sensitive. Maybe your enthusiasm was met with indifference, teaching you that caring makes you vulnerable and vulnerability makes you a target. This is where attachment theory becomes critical. When children experience inconsistent caregiving, when affection is unpredictable, when emotional needs are dismissed, they develop what psychologists call avoidant attachment patterns. The internal logic becomes brutally clear. If caring leads to disappointment, then the solution is to stop caring, or at least, to stop showing it. But here's the thing about emotions, you can't simply turn them off like flipping a switch. The feelings don't disappear, they just go underground, they tunnel deeper, they hide in the places you don't look. And neuroscience shows us something remarkable. When we suppress emotions, our amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center, actually becomes more active, not less. Your body is working overtime to contain what your mind is trying to deny. You're not indifferent, you're just exhausted from pretending. Let's talk about what this armor actually protects, because pretending not to care serves a purpose. It's not random, it's not weakness. It's a strategy that once made perfect sense, probably when you were younger and had fewer resources to protect yourself. The logic is elegant. If you don't care, you can't be hurt. If you don't try, you can't fail. If you don't want anything, no one can deny you. It's a fortress built from disappointment, a shield forged from past wounds. But here's the problem with armor. It's indiscriminate. When you shut down the painful feelings, the disappointment, the rejection, the hurt, you also shut down your capacity for joy, for love, for connection. The armor doesn't discriminate. It blocks everything. Research by Brené Brown on vulnerability confirms this. You cannot selectively numb emotions. When you close the door to pain, you also close the door to meaning, to aliveness, to the very things that make life worth living. So when you pretend not to care about the job interview, you rob yourself of the pride you'd feel if you got it. When you act indifferent about the relationship, you deny yourself the joy of genuine connection. When you shrug off your own accomplishments, you prevent yourself from building authentic self-worth. The armor protects you from nothing, but it costs you everything. And this is where it gets complex, because the person who pretends not to care is often someone who cares so intensely that it frightens them. They feel everything at a volume that feels unbearable, so they turn down the dial by performing the opposite. This is the paradox. The apathy is actually evidence of deep feeling. Think about how much emotional intelligence it takes to construct and maintain this facade. You have to be acutely aware of your genuine emotions in order to hide them effectively. You have to know exactly what you're feeling to project the opposite. The person who says, "I don't care," often knows their emotional landscape better than most. They've mapped every valley, every peak, every dangerous cliff edge. They just can't show it to you, because showing you would mean admitting it to themselves, and that feels like walking toward danger with your eyes wide open, so they close their eyes instead. They pretend, they perform, they protect, but here's what they don't realize. The pretending is the danger. Social psychology research on impression management tells us that we all engage in self-presentation. We all curate how others see us. But when it becomes rigid, when it becomes your only mode of being, it signals something else. Fear, the person who can never show care, never admit desire, never reveal disappointment. They're not protecting themselves from others. They're protecting themselves from themselves. Because if you acknowledge that you care, you also have to acknowledge that you're vulnerable, that outcomes matter, that other people have power over your emotional state, that you can be hurt, and for someone who's been hurt before, who's felt the sting of rejection or abandonment or mockery, that feels unbearable. But the cost of this protection is connection. When you pretend not to care, you're not just hiding from pain, you're hiding from people. You're putting up a wall and hoping that somehow, magically, the right people will see through it, that someone will love you enough to excavate the real person beneath all that practiced indifference. But relationships don't work like that. Intimacy requires mutuality. It requires showing up as you actually are, not as a carefully edited version designed to prevent hurt. Mirror neurons in our brains make us wired for connection. We literally feel what others feel through neural resonance. But when someone presents a blank facade, there's nothing to mirror. The connection can't happen because there's nothing genuine to connect with. You're not protecting yourself. You're isolating yourself. And here's where it gets even darker. The more you pretend not to care, the more you reinforce the neural pathways that make indifference your default. Your brain starts to believe your own performance. The mask begins to fuse with your face. Psychologists who study emotion regulation have found that chronic suppression is linked to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and even physical health problems. Your body knows you're lying, even if your conscious mind has bought the story. The dissonance creates stress. It manifests in sleepless nights, tension, headaches, that persistent sense that something isn't quite right. You feel disconnected from yourself because you are. The person you show the world and the person you are inside have become strangers. And worst of all, you might not even realize you're still stuck in survival mode. Because when dysfunction is normalized early, your nervous system accepts chaos as baseline. Stillness feels wrong. Peace feels suspicious. Love feels like a debt you'll have to repay. This is what happens when you spend years pretending not to care. You forget what it feels like to care openly. You forget what it feels like to be yourself. But here's the truth that no one tells you. The people who pretend not to care are often the ones who care most deeply. They're not cold. They're protecting something precious, their capacity to feel, their vulnerability, the tender parts of themselves that have been hurt before. And that's not weakness. That's intelligence. That's survival. But what saved you then imprisons you now. So what do you do if this is you? If you recognize yourself in these patterns? First, understand this. The impulse to protect yourself isn't wrong. The strategy just isn't working anymore. What worked when you were younger? When you had less power, fewer resources, less ability to leave harmful situations, might not serve the person you are now. You're no longer that child whose feelings were dismissed. You're no longer that teenager whose vulnerability was mocked. You have more agency than you did then, more choice, more capacity to choose who gets access to your inner world. But your nervous system doesn't know that. It's still running the old program, still trying to keep you safe in ways that are now keeping you stuck. The first step is simply noticing. Catching yourself in the moment when you're about to say, "I don't care," and asking, is that true? Or is that the armor talking? You don't have to change anything at first. Just notice how your body feels when you suppress genuine enthusiasm. Notice the loneliness that comes from hiding your real self. Notice how exhausting it is to maintain the performance. Because awareness is not weakness. It's the beginning of choice. And this is where it gets hopeful. Research in neuroplasticity tells us that your brain can change. The patterns that feel so fixed, so fundamental to who you are, they're actually malleable. With practice, you can build new neural pathways. You can learn to care openly without catastrophizing the consequences. It starts small. Maybe you tell one trusted person about something that matters to you. Maybe you let yourself feel excited about a possibility without immediately dampening it with cynicism. Maybe you admit, just to yourself at first, that yes, you do care, and yes, that might feel terrifying. Your nervous system might scream danger. Every instinct might tell you to retreat back into the safety of indifference. But here's the thing about vulnerability. It's not actually dangerous anymore. The situation has changed even if the feeling hasn't caught up. Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion offers a different path forward. Instead of armoring yourself against care, what if you could hold your caring with gentleness? What if you could say, yes, I care about this, and if it doesn't work out, I'll be okay. I'll be disappointed, but I'll survive. I'll hurt, but I'll heal. That's not weakness. That's courage. Real strength isn't pretending nothing affects you. Real strength is feeling everything and staying present anyway. Because here's what most people don't understand. The opposite of caring isn't indifference, it's numbness. And numbness isn't protection. It's slow death. When you pretend not to care, you're not avoiding pain. You're avoiding life. You're turning down the volume on everything. The disappointments, yes, but also the joy, the connection, the meaning, the moments that make being human worth it. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that people pretend not to care, but what they lose in the pretending. They lose the ability to celebrate their own victories. They lose the capacity for genuine intimacy. They lose the simple pleasure of wanting something and admitting it, of hoping for something and letting themselves hope. They become ghosts in their own lives. Present but not really there. Watching but not really feeling. Existing but not really living, but it doesn't have to be that way. If you're someone who's spent years perfecting the art of not caring, I want you to know something. All that caring you've been hiding doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. The fact that you care so much that you had to build walls to contain it, that speaks to the depth of your capacity for feeling, for connection, for love. You're not too sensitive. You're not too much. You were just in environments that couldn't hold your intensity. And you learned to dim yourself to survive. But you're not in that environment anymore. You don't have to perform indifference to be safe. You don't have to pretend you're made of stone to be strong. The tender parts of you, the parts that care deeply, that hope earnestly, that feel intensely, those aren't flaws to fix. They're the most human parts of you. They're the parts that connect you to others. They're the parts that make life rich and textured and meaningful. And the people who mocked you for caring, the ones who made you feel like your feelings were a burden, they were wrong. They were dealing with their own discomfort with emotion and projected it onto you. Their inability to hold space for your feelings said everything about their limitations and nothing about your worth. So here's the invitation. You don't have to perform indifference to protect yourself anymore. You can take off the armor, slowly, carefully, at your own pace. You can let people see that you care. You can admit that things matter to you. You can be disappointed without being destroyed. You can be vulnerable without being weak. And in those moments when it feels too scary, when every instinct screams at you to retreat back into indifference, remember this, that the opposite of indifference isn't pain. It's aliveness. It's feeling the full spectrum of what it means to be human. The disappointments and the delights, the heartbreaks and the hope, the risks and the rewards. Not everything you experience is meant to be protected. Sometimes the most profound things in life happen when you stop defending and start feeling. Because what was once frozen is finally thawing. And yes, that means you might get hurt again, but it also means you might finally feel alive. And maybe that's what the people who pretend not to care are really afraid of. Not the caring itself, but what caring makes possible. Connection, meaning, joy, the very things that make vulnerability worth it. So the next time you catch yourself saying, I don't care, pause. Ask yourself what you're really protecting. Ask yourself what it's costing you. Because in the end, we're not meant to be untouchable. We're meant to be touched. We're meant to be moved. We're meant to care about things, about people, about outcomes. That's not weakness. That's what makes us human. And the people who pretend they don't care, they're not cold, they're not empty, they're not broken, they're just people who learned that caring was dangerous. And now they're learning, slowly, carefully, courageously, that maybe it's safe to care again. Maybe it's safe to feel again. Maybe it's safe to hope again. Maybe it's safe to finally take off the armor and stand there, vulnerable and real and terrifyingly alive, because that's not something to protect yourself from. That's something to run toward.